Hi everyone, good morning. I'm really happy to start this day today. Thank you, the organizers, for this lovely conference. It has been really inspiring. So I'm a PhD student at the University of Tartu, and I would like to present you one of the topics that I've been covering in my thesis. I would like to show what kind of folklore was valued in early Soviet Estonia, and for that I have been using some materials from Folklore Department of the State Literary Museum, the Accession Records, and evaluation protocols to show how the folklorists adapted to the new system and how did they overcome the problems that they had in this ideological situation that was new for them. So very briefly, to give an overview of the Estonian history, Estonia was part of the Russian Empire until World War I. During the course of World War I, it became an independent republic and was occupied by the Soviets in 1940. 1 year of Soviet occupation was ended by 3 years of Nazi German occupation after that. And after that, Soviet occupation began again. It was ideologically a very difficult and a very complex period, but especially the first years, there were also the years where Stalin was ruling the Soviet Union, were ideologically very strict. So the Estonians had to adapt to a new ideological system, that was very different from before, and in the Stalinist system, also stricter than it was later on. There were different changes taking place in the society. What I would like to emphasize right now are just a couple of things, like censorship of the culture, evaluation of the previous work done in the culture, and the changes in institutional networks. One of the institutions that had a different name and institutional affiliation before the Soviet occupation were the Estonian folklore archives. During the Soviet period, they were called the Folklore Department of the State Literary Museum, and they were one of the three bigger folkloristics institutions with their own collections. The people there would study folklore, they would write about folklore, they would do presentations about folklore and conduct field work. And in Folklore Department, it is important to note that they were historically very important and had really the joy and burden of very large collections. For example, in the year 1949, there were over 730,000 pages of folklore. Of course, there were also photos and some sound recordings, but in this period that I'm covering, the early Soviet period, still the most folklore texts were recorded in a traditional way, meaning that people would just write down the texts that would become archived in the archives. And only part of these texts were documented by folklorists themselves. A large part was documented by correspondence. So these were the people who would be interested in documenting folklore in their everyday surroundings. They would either use some questionnaires sent to them or published, or they would just document what they heard and saw and send this to the archives. And this is a tradition that's been in Estonian folkloristics, that people have been doing this from the 19th century onwards. Another point that I would like to emphasize right now is that the people who worked in the Folklore Department of the State Literary Museum were pre-war folklorists. They were educated in a pre-war university, and they had been working in the pre-war archives. Only in the mid-1950s, young colleagues who had been educated in the Soviet system started their work in the Folklore Department. But the people who worked in the Folklore Department in 1940s and early 50s, they had this pre-war understanding of what is folklore and what is good folklore, what is valuable folklore, what is interesting folklore. And although they learned the Soviet terminology and the new definition of folklore, and although they went to all Soviet conferences to present findings of reevaluating their previous work and documenting new kinds of folklore, still what they continued to value was this pre-war understanding of folklore. One of the things that was expected from these folklorists was to document new kinds of folklore called Soviet folklore. Soviet folklore would depict life in the Soviet Union in a very positive way. So it would have Soviet topics such as industrial communities, also meaning workers' folklore or worker folklore about revolutions or newly founded collective farms, such as kolhozes and sovkhozes, but also World War II or Great Patriotic War. These kinds of folklore were expected from the folklorists that they would be in the archives. They could present this in the newspapers. As you can see here, there's a newspaper where it stated that the folklore about kolhozes, the collective farms, is needing the right to live. And folklorists would struggle to find folklore on these topics that would be positive. They would sometimes hear jokes about Soviet system. It was also briefly discussed of if these jokes should be archived. But as they're critical about the political situation, it was decided no, these kinds of materials should not be stored for the future generations. Only positive materials should be there. So the folklorists themselves, they were struggling to find these materials, but there were also the correspondence, right? People who would write for the archives and who have been doing this also in the pre-war years were also struggling to understand what is expected from them. And that's why some kind of weird materials landed in the archives and were sometimes also archived as folklore or as Soviet folklore. People would write poems about their experiences in World War II or about working in kolhozes, or send some childhood memories to the archives, writings from wall newspapers. So all kinds of various materials that would somehow have something to do with the Soviet content, but less to do with the understanding of folklore that the folklorists had in these years, would be archived in these years just to show that there are these amounts of incoming materials on the suitable topics. And only these materials that were nice enough to be quoted, ended up in the presentations and the newspaper text. But most of this that really didn't fit with this understanding of folklore in the Soviet way or in the traditional older way, that just, sat there in the archives and was not used. The correspondents, some of them were really good in adapting the new system. So there was this one correspondent who, during the German occupation, would send jokes about Soviets to the archives. In the Soviet period, she would send kolkhoz folklore and would find her way of doing this. There were some other correspondents who really didn't know what to do. So there was, for example, this one man who would live near one industrial community, and he was suggested to document the folklore of this area. And he was saying, no, this is not folklore, I'm not doing this. And the folklorists really had to convince him to document these kinds of materials, because this would be folklore in the Soviet sense. And now to the main slide of my presentation. As I said, so many different materials landed in the archives as folklore, and the accession records show what kind of folklore or what kind of materials the folklorists would actually value highly and what not that highly. There are a couple of things that I would like to point out in this graph. The first thing is the accession records. You can see the blue line, it just drops in the early 1950s. So in 1940s, it was ideologically really hard to adapt to the new system, but the people were somehow coping. In 1949, there was a mass deportation, and in 1950s, the ideological pressure got really much harder, and it was very hard to find a suitable way to say anything. So people were afraid to do anything where their opinion would be asked, and they would also not send so many materials to the folklore archives. They were rather worried about their life at all. This is not seen in the graph, but in the 1960s, this would be going up again. So only the Stalinist period, the early 1950s, would be so harsh in the manner of dropping accessions. So the Taxation Records is a book, is a list of every material that would land in the archive in these years. So there would be a note about the amount of pages, who sent it, genre, and usually also a short commentary about the materials. It could state that it's in a good dialect. It could state that the songs are good, but the legends are not that good. So these kinds of materials would help to orient, to find a way in the new collections before they were ordinarily archived and indexed. And the materials were also evaluated. It was either said that they were good or very good or satisfactory. You can see that most of the materials were evaluated. What wasn't evaluated were the materials collected by folklorists themselves, because they didn't want to really evaluate the work of colleagues. And also what often wasn't evaluated was the work that was not good enough to really even be satisfactory. So for example, some poems that would be written in albums and were not seen as interesting or folkloric enough in these years. They were archived, but they were not seen as valuable enough to be evaluated. And in the first Soviet years, it was also typical not to evaluate the Soviet folklore. So it seems that the folklorists were not really sure what to do with these materials that were sent in the archives about the Great Patriotic War, where somebody writes a play about the things that happened in a war, and they would archive it, but they wouldn't say if they found it good or bad because they were unsure about this content. Most of the materials that landed in archives were evaluated as good. You see that in the 1950s, really most of the evaluations are really good. So the yellow line and the red line meet. In the 1950s, folklorists were really much more careful in what they wrote down. So the notes in Taxation Records hardly ever show their opinions anymore. It's just the genres that are listed, and they would value the Soviet folklore in a high way. It wouldn't mean that every kinds of folklore in a Soviet topic would be given a very, very high note. So if it was really badly written poems that would have nothing to do with folklore, it would still not get a valuation of a good or very good. But most of the folkloristic materials about Soviet topics in the 1950s were evaluated as very good. But what continued to be evaluated as good or very good throughout the years were the materials that would fit to the idea of authenticity that the folklorists had in these years. So very many materials that are stated to be good are said authentic, or in a good dialect, and a good dialect would also indicate that it's authentic materials that are not just improvised by the collector themselves. And the collectors who would continue to send these authentic materials, or just materials that would seem so folkloric that the folklorists would find them good. They continued to get high prices, high valuations also in the 1950s. So they would value authenticity, what's really complicated issue in terms of folklore, obviously, because in order to folklore to be authentic, it has to it has to have variations, and it can't just be a copy of another kind of folklore. But the folklorists who had been conducting fieldwork themselves and knew their archival collections would have a good feeling what is authentic and what's not. But the Soviet folklore would be evaluated on different criteria. Just this question of authenticity was not that relevant there. Yeah, another other thing I would like to show in this graph are the monetary awards awarded for the best kinds of folklore. So in 1948, there was a conference where it was decided that because all kinds of work is being paid for in the Soviet Union, also the volunteer correspondents should be paid for their work. Paying for folklore, as in the history of Estonian folkloristics, it has been a complex issue, and it has not been seen positively. So in the 19th century, Jakob Hurt, one of the most important figures in the history of Estonian folkloristics, would say that another initiator of collecting campaigns, Jakob Matthias Johann Eisen, who would award books to the people, that he shouldn't be doing this, and people are only writing down folklore for the books, and to get really authentic folklore, people have to do this without the rewards, just for the sake of the cultural heritage. And in 1948, it was decided that the correspondents should be paid for their work. And so there was this evaluation commission sitting together and seeing these folklore materials again and deciding what would be paid for. And here you also see the same pattern, that the materials the folklorists saw as authentic, they got also the higher notes and were paid more than the materials they were unsure of. Also the Soviet folklore in the first Soviet years. In 1950s, people who collected Soviet folklore also got some monetary awards. Yeah, and the monetary awards should be rewarding for the people, and it should actually bring the numbers of folklore coming in up. But as you see, the ideological pressure was so harsh that the folklore was, the incoming folklore was not getting more, so it was getting less. Although it was paid rather well, so the materials that would be evaluated as satisfactory were paid 1 ruble per page. Materials that were good got 2 rubles per page, and very good materials 3 rubles per page. And just for comparison, the monthly salary in State Literary Museum, the cleaners would get up to 290 rubles per month, and the head of State Literary Museum would get 2,000 rubles per month. And some people who sent folklore materials to the State Literary Museum, they were collecting hundreds of pages, and collecting hundreds of pages of folklore that would be evaluated as very good would be a very notable extra income. But yet people were so unsure of what to collect, how to collect, that even the good monetary awards didn't really motivate them to do this. So to sum up, I would like to think of a suitable theoretical approach to discuss these issues. First of all, I would like to think of these people who sent in Soviet texts for the archives, who sent their own poems, who sent their own plays, because I suppose for these people, collecting folklore or creating what they would see as folklore, writing these poems, would be a chance to adapt to the new system, and they would write to a Soviet institution, and they would fit with the new order that is there in the system. So there were these people who weren't in the correspondence of the Soviet of the Literary Museum before, and they weren't this in the 60s either, but in the 1940s and 1950s they did find this way of communicating in terms of folklore with this institution. And that's very interesting. It's a very interesting historical document of what these people thought that would be interesting for folklorists in these years. In 1960s and 1970s, there were still some people who would send folklore about kolkhozes, or who would send folklore about revolution, some texts about the revolutions to the archives. And some of these materials did get archived, but there's also like this big box of unarchived materials from the Soviet period, just standing in the basement of the Literary Museum. And these are the materials that didn't get archived. So the correspondents sent them to the archives, and they were not good enough to be incorporated in the collections. But there was still some people who tried to communicate with the folklore archives in this way. And to see what's interesting for the folklorist, what is valued by the folklorist, and how research politics changed in the first Soviet years. Accession records are a beautiful document to have a mirror of this research politics. And I do know that, as Elohanna pointed out the day before, that using the terminology of post-colonialism and discussing Soviet period could be a slippery road, and there are several problems. But I do think that in order to get out of this binary way of thinking about people's actions as collaboration or resistance to the Soviet system, and to see this in a more nuanced way, some terminology of colonialism is very very useful. For example, understanding the actions of the folklorists in terms of mimicry. So they would copy the Soviet system. They would copy the right ways of expressing themselves about folklore. They would copy the statements that would get printed. They would try to adapt and say what was expected of them, to use right parlance. But at the same time, the core values of the folklorists remain similar to the pre-war ideals. So what you can see from different documents is that what actually was valued from them in the highest possible way was the folklore that they found to be authentic, that they found to be something that's this typical Estonian folklore. And they just tried to fit some parts of this folklore to the Soviet system, or document and discuss the Soviet folklore in order to have this other kind of folklore, this what they would see as real folklore going on at the same time. And doing folkloristics in the early Soviet Union, in the early Soviet Estonia, was a hybrid act where this political pressure and their pre-war understandings of folklore were mixed for the folklorists, and they tried to find their way in a new system, to adapt to the new system, and new kinds of folkloristics were born out of that. Some kinds of new research interests, some kinds of studies that would have not been made in any other ideological system than of that of the Soviet occupation, or, if you want, a Soviet colonialism of these years. So thank you. And I'm happy to have any questions.